What is education, and why is education important? Is it important? After all, what's the real purpose of getting educated about anything? We so frequently take education and the process for learning in general totally for granted. Not only that, but the ways in which we think. How we've gone about structuring our own consciousness itself has largely remained unchanged for a long, long time. So how do we literally change our minds? Can we reconfigure our own ways of thinking? And if so, how? Join Dr. Joseph Atman, the founder of one of the world's most revolutionary educational centers, Middletree, and award-winning broadcaster Tammy Trujillo for Educate Everyone, and explore the mysteries of our own consciousness and the education we implement in order for it to be what it is.
And on this episode of Educate Everyone, we continue our conversation with Dr. Estela Mara Bensimon. She's the Dean's Professor in Educational Equity at USC Rossier School of Education and Director of the Center for Urban Education, which she founded in 1999. With a singular focus on increasing racial equity and higher education outcomes for students of color, she developed the Equity Scorecard, a process for using inquiry to drive changes in institutional practice and culture. Dr. Bensimon has published extensively about equity, organizational learning, practitioner inquiry, and change. Now here's Dr. Bensimon with Dr. Joseph Atman.
Your work brings in the issue of quote-unquote whiteness. Your work does. I think that's something that people have to decide whether or not that's a good way to frame it. I think that's an important thing to call out and ask. Is that a good way to frame it? But go on.
Actually, many scholars...
That doesn't hold a lot of water. I think scholars get us into a lot of these issues, and I'm one of them. I'm not sure that we can rely on the work of scholars to be the representative voice for the majority of people, especially on these issues.
Let me just give you an example. We have created a variety of tools that are you a faculty member yourself?
I'm not, no. I was just wondering what that has to do with anything.
Well, I was going to give you an example. When we work with faculty, one of the tools that we use is what we call the gradebook mapping by race and ethnicity. And what we do is that, if you think about a gradebook, it has a column that has the names of the students. And then you can rate them in terms of attendance, submission of homework, grades in tests, and so on. So what we do is, instead of having the column with the names, we have the racial, ethnic identity of each student. And then we color code each of those criteria, like grades, attendance, and so forth. And we color code in terms of if students are absent, they have a certain number of absences, we may color code it in red, and so on. Well, that exercise actually increased the awareness of faculty in looking at their own grade books, that, first of all, that some of their assumptions were wrong. For instance, they thought that in one class, that the reason why Latinx students were performing below other students was because they were not coming to class. But in fact, they had perfect attendance. And what the issue was that they were not submitting the homework because either they didn't understand how to do the homework or they were apprehensive that they were not going to do it correctly. So that faculty member changed the way that homework was done, and he had amazing outcomes. He said the outcomes for his class for the Latinx students went from 45% to 85%. So what I'm speaking about is that if faculty members become aware of the ways in which their practices are not working equally, they can be changed. But higher education has not done a very good job of developing faculty expertise, competency in working effectively with minoritized students. Another tool that we developed was what we call the syllabus review. Each course in undergraduate education has a syllabus, but often the syllabi do not reflect the knowledge, the history, the literature, the art, the music of minoritized populations. But rather than telling faculty that, we want them to discover, to be the anthropologists of their own syllabi and see that the ways in which their syllabus is not inclusive, it's not inviting, the language that is used is often punitive. But I'm not lecturing them. I am providing the tools that enable faculty, like I said, to be anthropologists of their own practices. And we have found that this method has worked extremely well in developing faculty awareness of things that might be considered divisive, because it's not a lecture. So I'm not giving a lecture on whiteness. I'm giving tools that enable faculty members, for instance, to discover the ways in which the pedagogies that they use that are based on their own experience, perhaps, and are not working for students, have not had the same experiences that they have.
I think that's really interesting that there have faculty members make that distinction so that they can see and reflect on how they're doling out material for folks. And did you find that Latinx students or whoever was affected by this was affected mostly because of a language barrier, because of, you said that they're not doing it correctly?
I said that they are apprehensive, that they may not be doing it right.
And why is that? Because that's the real question, because it was framed by the professor in a way that made it difficult linguistically, or what did you find in that regard?
Because these students come with a history of experiencing failure. And so, of course, they're sensitive to that.
Or why do they come with that history of experiencing failure? For the same reasons, because
often teachers make assumptions about them and do not necessarily reach out to the students. The educational history of most minoritized students is not a good one. And that's why we have inequalities persisting.
Yeah, I was just looking for clarity as to why that is. Again, is it a language barrier?
The majority of Latinx students in higher education, many of them have been born here. They just have gone often to poor quality high schools. So just like, my guidance counselor did not think that I was college material. Well, that's a pervasive sentiment that minoritized students are not encouraged to think about college or the opportunities that may be available to them. That's what I'm getting at. It's not a language problem.
Sounds more like a cultural problem, and that students in areas aren't getting the best access that they could to an education that others in more affluent areas have access to. It again sounds like maybe it's a power dynamic or an affluence problem.
But not a racial problem?
Well, I think that all ties together, that so many minorities are in those kinds of communities. And that's where we need to focus so much of our energy and attention so that we can give all the help and assistance to folks who, everybody needs help. Our work, at Middletree, it certainly was founded and exclusively focused on students who really needed that help, largely because of the fact that they were just kind of born behind the eight ball a little bit, as it were. I think you can't just say it's just a racial problem. It's a societal problem.
If you look at all the indicators of inequality, the indicators will show you that it is a racial problem because it affects primarily certain groups. One of the things that I have found in my work is that people become very sensitive when they feel that they're being blamed. And so they don't want to speak directly to the issues, right? But that is the kind of a fragility, isn't it?
I think there's some truth to that. But again, it kind of goes back to my question of why are we blaming? Why are we not looking for solutions? Why are we pointing fingers rather than pointing forward? Why blame anyone?
No, nobody's being blamed. When I explain to you the methods that we use, they do not involve any kind of blame. What they involve is developing an awareness that while we may be thinking that we're treating all students equally, in fact, the practices that we employ are not. And so it's about developing that awareness. The faculty that I have worked with that I mentioned earlier, one of them realized, for instance, that he never had reached out to Latinx students, to talk to them, to get to know them as individuals. So that's what I'm talking about. We tend to direct our attention to those who are most like us. And so when you have higher education institutions that are predominantly white in terms of their faculty, that's what happens. They don't question, okay, why is it that when I have my office hours, the majority of the students who come are not Black or are not Latinx and so on? Why is it that they're mostly white? So I want faculty members to become aware of that is what's going on, and to be able to question it and to see what they could be doing differently so that that's not the phenomenon that continues.
Is this the same reason that mostly white students show up to office hours? So the question is, because you're trying to make professors aware of the fact that white students are coming and interacting with them more than minority students. So is the reason for that happening the same as why, minority students weren't engaging with the academic materials that they had put out there in the same way and at the same rate with those other things that you were talking about before? If so, again, what's the root cause of that, and how is that fixable?
I think that there are many reasons. One is that faculty, like I said before, make assumptions about students, and they may not necessarily identify them as individuals who want to learn, who want to be successful, so they don't reach out to them. Another reason is that the high school preparation is quite different for minoritized students who have high poverty schools. They're highly segregated, so that contributes to the problem. The third reason may be that nobody has taught the students what office hours, for instance, mean. What do you do when you go to the faculty member's office? And so they don't know what to say, and faculty members may not know how to be accessible to their students during those office hours. By that I mean accessible, meaning inviting and wanting to genuinely get to know better the students. Going to office hours is a learned practice. It's a learned middle class practice. And students who have not had those kinds of models may not know what to do, what to say, and realize that office hours are not punitive. They're there to be of assistance to students for the most part. So that's what I'm getting at. Science faculty often have labs, and they choose students to be lab assistants. The tendency is to choose the very, very best students in the science class. So what I am trying to offer as an alternative is those students that are the very, very, very best do not need this. But the students who do are the ones who are maybe in the middle and who need that encouragement and, mentors. That's what I'm talking about, that becoming aware that often our practices reinforce the inequalities that we see in our data. We see it in our graduation data, in enrollment data, in who participates in honors programs, and so on. That's basically it.
And so how do you encourage those kind of students? Or is the onus on professors, and again, those in power in this, again, scenario, because I think it really does come down to more of a power dynamic thing, is the onus on those folks in power to tap those who are not and say, hey, I want to pull you up. I want to bring you along with me. I want you to be my lab assistant. I want you to be my research assistant. I want you to help me with this. So in your opinion, is the onus on them? I could see from, again, the folks who are in power, not just in this situation, but in any situation, how they would want, of course, the best and the brightest and the folks on paper. But frequently, and I would also say, and maybe push back a little bit and say, and understanding everything that you're mentioning here about how people don't always know what the proper way to conduct themselves is. And it's not a punitive thing to be invited in or to do some of the things that you've talked about here. But I could see from the position of the folks who are in that position of power, the professors, or again, across any power dynamics, you want the best, you want the brightest. But frequently those best and brightest are those who are most motivated, most willing. And even though certainly I think, again, our backgrounds determine so much about who we are, of course, and so much of who we are is influenced by the society, the culture, the financial situation, the economic situations we were brought up in. But there's also, again, onus and impetus on folks themselves, on individuals to pull themselves up. So I think it's kind of probably a balance. Yeah, by their own bootstraps.
But that's a myth.
Those in power to give them better bootstraps.
That's the American exceptionalism, myth. The fact is that we don't pay attention to the fact that nobody really pulls themselves up by their own bootstraps, but that they are often
we all get some help, right?
And some are helped more than others. And that's the point. But, I was a professor at USC. I was a professor in the PhD program, which attracts highly qualified students. But I also was aware that I had a lot of power as a faculty member and that I could use that power on behalf of those who needed it most or on behalf of those who had already had all those privileges. And so I chose to dedicate myself to working in the PhD program with minoritized students, often who had started their education in community colleges or less selective institutions. They had not gone to Wellesley or to Wesleyan or to one of the prestigious colleges, the Pomona colleges, Stanford, and so on. And so I decided that I would work with those students and provide them with the resources to be successful PhD students and to be able to qualify for faculty positions when they graduated. And so that, I would say, is the difference between using your power resources or your knowledge resources on behalf of those who have already had the opportunities versus using it for those who have not had the opportunities.
Certainly, this is where I think, again, that onus is sort of on all of us, but especially those in power, to give people better bootstraps by which to pull themselves up. And I think it's up to all of us to try and contribute more to making sure that everybody is invested in, because the vast majority of folks are not afforded what we would call basic opportunities. That there are so many people that just don't have access to a stable home, a stable life in general. So I think that's up to all of us to try and make sure that in whatever small ways we can, that we are doing what we can to make sure that people have those opportunities. Because if people are in the best position possible, that's to everybody's benefit. So you could even look at that as a selfish aim, is you want the other person to succeed for your own well-being, for your family's well-being. Because again, when everybody succeeds, everybody succeeds. And again, that's kind of what I was talking about before, and we're running out of time. And so I'd love to continue this conversation again down the line. But I think this is what I was saying before, is like, I believe that everybody is really trying, and in their heart of hearts, want the utopia that so many are aspiring towards. And I think that we can get there in a way, but it comes from a change of mindset, and that change of mindset will then inform the practices thereafter.
I think that is what I have been discussing, that it is a different cognitive frame or a different mindset. And we may all have the desire to help others, but we don't always know how to, because we think helping others is based on our own cultural and historical experiences. And what I'm saying is that there is a different way, that the way is, rather than focusing on the students having the right bootstraps, we need to focus on faculty having the right expertise, knowledge, to be able to be effective with a population that may be unlike them.
Sure, understood. But I then push back and say, but then we're waiting on faculty to do a job that we could all maybe help out with.
Yeah, absolutely. And California is a great example of progressive legislation, except that now it's much more difficult. I mean, we eliminated affirmative action in higher education. We are eliminating scholarships that were designated for minoritized populations. And so we are basically eliminating just about all of the good things that had been happening.
Well, Estela, I would love to continue this conversation if you would come back, because I think it's a really important one. And I think that's where we should pick up next time, because I do think we need to talk about that and make people aware of what's going on in that regard and whether or not that's a good thing. Thank you so much for being here. This is a really, really important conversation, and the work that you were doing sounded like it was extraordinarily important and impactful. So thank you for that, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to having a conversation.
And now the Middle Tree Minute.
This is Kristen Hernandez, Middle Tree's executive assistant. Studying doesn't have to feel boring or stressful. Turn review time into a game show by asking questions and letting your child buzz in with a spoon, bell, or even their voice. You can add silly prizes like picking the next family movie or choosing a dessert. This playful approach lowers stress and increases engagement. When learning feels fun, kids are more likely to remember what they've practiced. And that's the Middle Tree Minute.
And now a quick look into Dr. Atman's book, A Philosophical War. Joe, we are starting to get deeper into this question of why. Now, why seems pretty simple, right? It's a little word, but it seems to go a whole heck of a lot deeper. What more is there to know?
Everything than why. If we can figure out the why of not just, as we kind of said last time, of not just everything, but anything, that will lead us to many more layers and depths of our comprehension of our own existence and the existence of phenomena of being, of consciousness itself. So it's why, no pun intended, it's why at the onset of this, we have and are paying so much attention to that question. Why? Because again, if we look at and understand what the question of why actually implies, well, if why has an answer, if that question of why has an answer, then it means that there was an intention behind it. And again, the consequence is so profound when we really start to unpack and examine it. And like you said, it seems like a really simple thing. Well, why? Well, because, right? You ask your parents, well, why? Well, because I said so. But there's always, in our argument here in a philosophical war, is any and everything that happens, all of it has a how, right? The question of how did that happen? Well, you trace, sort of cosmologically, step by step back, go back in time and you can kind of get to any sort of end point of anything that happens within phenomena, any evolution. You can sort of see the revolutions of the evolution, A to B to C to D to E. You get where we arrived at the end of the alphabet if you trace it back. But the why is a much larger mystery, and again is not as apparent on the surface because, as we'd also talked about previously, we give primacy, we give our fullest attention, generally speaking, to the how of things and to the way in which things unpack themselves in a physical reality, which again makes a ton of sense. We're physical beings, but we're also conscious beings. We're also beings with this relationship to this metaphysical world because of the fact that we're just continually struggling for survival itself, right, within the physical world, that we sometimes don't give as much attention to that metaphysical space that we could argue we actually inhabit at a larger and deeper level than this physical reality, this physical nature, this how of things. So I wanted to really look at here at the beginning as we're setting the stage, and we're still continuing to set the stage 30 some odd segments into this, right? Because this is such a giant thing to unpack. We really have to be so super, super prepared and comprehending of all the layers and depths and consequences thereof within all of these things. And this delineation and distinction between how and why becomes very, very significant when we start to understand that in order to really comprehend what phenomena, what being, what things that start to almost hearken into this mystical realm that some might identify that we're not quite going there, but you could easily draw a straight line between that kind of thought, that kind of pattern of thinking or speech people tend to sort of sway into when you start to talk about things that aren't necessarily always connected to a physical reality, this how, this mechanistic, this straight in front of us physical being and otherness that we encounter within the physical realm. When you start to stray away from that, people don't really know what that space is because it's not as immediately available. So they tend to start to, again, use words like mysticism and spirituality and all that. But when we unpack and look at this question of why, it starts to drift into maybe potentially answering some of those long sought questions that religion, spirituality, mysticism has sought to answer for such a long, long time.
Thank you for listening to Educate Everyone with Dr. Joseph Atman and Tammy Trujillo. Join us each week as we explore the inner workings of our own minds and the educational system which builds and supports it. Also, check out our website at middletree.org to see what opportunities Middletree's programs can offer you or your student. And join us on social media. If you have any questions you'd like Dr. Atman to answer, please leave them on a post or send us a message, and you may hear them answered on the next episode of Educate Everyone. Until then, thanks for tuning in.